Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world of cigarette smoke, pearls and breathtaking audacity. The real life of Coco Chanel, not the perfume bottle, not the little black dress hanging in your closet like a polite ghost. I mean the actual woman, ruthless, brilliant, magnetic, and so thoroughly complicated that even the people who worshipped her weren't entirely sure they liked her. So before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a truly special thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, your taste is impeccable. Comments like yours are the reason this channel keeps growing, and they mean more than I can say. If you haven't already, you can also find us on Spotify now. The link is in the description, so you can drift off to this wherever you listen. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan for that soft background hum, pull your blanket up and get comfortable. Let's pause for just a second, because have you ever actually thought about what Coco Chanel's life was really like? Did she wake up elegant? Did she eat croissants in a silk robe while gazing moodily out a Parisian window? Was she always this composed? Or was there a version of her stress-eating baguettes behind a curtain? What do you do when you grow up with nothing and decide with terrifying certainty that you will become the most famous woman in fashion history? How do you get from an orphanage in rural France to the most coveted address in Paris? And what exactly do you leave behind to get there? And what about the parts nobody puts on the perfume bottle? The wartime years, the lovers, the grudges, the reinventions, the loneliness dressed up so impeccably it almost looked like freedom? Congratulations, you've just woken up in early 20th century France. The year is somewhere around 1910. The corsets are suffocating, the rules are relentless, and somewhere in a small atelier in Paris, a woman with dark eyes and a very strong opinion is about to change everything. Her name is Gabrielle. The world will come to know her as Coco, and nothing, not poverty, not war, not heartbreak, not time itself is going to stop her. Let's start at the very beginning, and the very beginning is not glamorous. Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel was born on August 19th, 1883, in a poor house in Saumur, France, to a street vendor father and a laundress mother who would be dead before Gabrielle turned 12. When her father dropped her and her sisters off at the orphanage run by the nuns of Aubezine, he told them he would be back. He was not back. Gabrielle grew up in cold stone corridors, learning to sew on the nuns' rigid schedule, staring at the black and white geometry of convent life, the same stark contrast that would later define every collection she ever produced. There are worse origin stories in history, but not many that produced quite this level of consequence. The convent of Aubezine sat in the Corrèze region of central France, which is beautiful country if you're a tourist, and relentlessly bleak if you are an abandoned child with no particular reason to expect things to improve. The nuns were not cruel, exactly. They were efficient, disciplined, and entirely uninterested in sentiment, which in certain lights looks a great deal like cruelty. They taught the girls to sew. They taught them to read. They taught them that order, silence, and obedience were the three great virtues, and they taught it by example, which meant every day looked almost exactly like the day before it. For a girl with Gabrielle's particular temperament, restless, watchful, already building a private mythology about herself in the absence of anyone else to do it for her, the convent was a kind of pressure cooker. The habits of discipline it forced on her would last a lifetime. The habits of invention it made necessary would last longer. The black and white of it seeped into everything she would later do. The nuns wore black and white. The corridors were scrubbed stone and dark wood. The windows were narrow and the light came in clean and unadorned. Scholars of her work have noted for decades that the Chanel aesthetic, the absence of unnecessary ornament, the clarity of line, the insistence on a certain severity as the foundation of elegance, maps almost perfectly onto the visual vocabulary of an Aubezine childhood. She took the convent's palette and turned it into a fashion philosophy. That is either deeply poetic or deeply practical, and with Coco Chanel it was always both at once. She stayed at Aubazine until she was around 18. Her father, who had apparently been travelling this whole time doing absolutely nothing useful, did eventually resurface long enough to arrange for her to move to a boarding school in Moulins run by nuns who were, by comparison, practically fun. Her sisters were with her for parts of this period, which helped. What also helped, in the way that painful things sometimes help, was the sheer repetition of disappointment. By the time Gabrielle Chanel left institutional care and stepped into the wider world, she'd been let down so thoroughly and so consistently by the people who were supposed to show up that she had developed something extremely useful, the absolute bone-deep certainty that she could not rely on anyone but herself. This is not a comfortable trait. People who love unconditionally and without armour are generally more pleasant to be around. But comfortable traits do not tend to build empires. Gabrielle Chanel left that orphanage with one outfit, a rudimentary education, exceptional sewing skills, and a quiet, burning fury that she would spend the next 80 years converting into couture. The nuns, for their part, probably had no idea what they had sent out into the world. Neither did the world. Here is something Coco Chanel spent her entire life doing with extraordinary dedication: lying. Not small, harmless lies, sweeping, architectural lies, built story by story like the very fashion empire she was constructing alongside them. She shaved years off her age so routinely that even she may have lost track. She relocated her birthplace. She erased her father. She eliminated the orphanage entirely, replacing it with a more poetic story of aunts who didn't particularly like children. The official Chanel mythology, the one she dictated, refined, and defended until her dying breath, bore very little resemblance to what actually happened. In an era when a woman's origins were her permanent address, Coco simply picked a new one and dared anyone to question her forwarding address. The version she preferred went something like this. She was raised by austere aunts in the Auvergne, learned to sew from them, and emerged into the world through her own ingenuity and talent. The aunts were real enough in spirit. There were female relatives involved at various points, but the tidy, self-contained narrative of provincial girlhood that Chanel offered interviewers bore almost no relationship to the broken family, the dead mother, the absent father, and the institutional childhood that actually happened. She was not lying out of shame, exactly. She was lying the way a very good architect lies when they design a beautiful facade, because the interior is complicated and load-bearing, and not available for public tours. Think about what she was working with. In the early 20th century, France was a rigidly stratified society, where your family name, your hometown, and your father's profession followed you into every room you entered. An orphan girl from a poor house had no business presenting herself at the doors of Paris society and expecting to be taken seriously. But a woman of modest provincial origins, self-taught, naturally gifted, with a particular kind of quiet confidence that suggested she simply hadn't gotten around to being impressed by you yet, that was a story people could work with. So Chanel wrote it. She wrote it constantly and consistently, and she wrote it so well that it eventually became the official record. She also lied about her age, which is at the more relatable end of the spectrum. She subtracted years from herself as casually as most people subtract sugar from their coffee, and she did it early enough and consistently enough that the false dates crept into formal records, official documents, and decades of journalism. When she died in 1971, multiple publications printed the wrong birth year in her obituary. She had corrected the historical record from beyond the grave, which, if you think about it, is impressive even by her standards. What is genuinely fascinating is that the lies were never really necessary. The true story, abandoned child, orphanage, convent education, provincial cabaret, sheer relentless will, is actually a more remarkable origin story than the polished fiction she substituted for it. The real Chanel was more interesting than the invented one, but she never trusted the world to see it that way, and perhaps she was right not to. She had learned, in those stone corridors and those cold classrooms, that the world gave you what you were already perceived to be worth. So she decided what she was worth, and she presented that version with such unwavering conviction that reality eventually rearranged itself around her. It is the oldest trick in the book. It is also, when executed at this level, genuinely extraordinary. Before she was Coco, she was Gabrielle, and Gabrielle spent a brief, complicated chapter of her life performing in small provincial cabarets in Moulins and Vichy in the early 1900s. She was not, by most accounts, a spectacular singer. What she was, however, was magnetic. She performed 2 songs with a particular kind of relentless repetition. Kika Vu Coco and Cocorico, and the audiences, bless them, started calling her Coco. She would carry that nickname for the rest of her life, which is remarkable when you consider that the alternative was a legacy built entirely on the word Gabrielle, which, while perfectly lovely, does not have quite the same electric snap to it. The cabarets of Moulins and Vichy were not glamorous venues. Let's be direct about this. They were provincial entertainment establishments serving audiences of soldiers, local businessmen, and the kind of gentlemen who spent their evenings in places their wives didn't know about. The performers were not stars. The pay was modest. The conditions were exactly what you would expect from a small French cabaret in 1905, which is to say, manageable if your alternatives were worse. And for Gabrielle, her alternatives were worse. She had a voice that was serviceable rather than remarkable, thin, clear, with a particular kind of directness to it, as though she were not so much singing at the audience as informing them of something. What she had in far greater quantity was presence. She moved differently from the other performers. She watched the room the way someone watches a room they intend to eventually own. She absorbed everything: how the wealthy men held themselves, what they found amusing, what made them uncomfortable, what they admired without admitting it. The cabaret stage was, in its way, another kind of education, faster and more brutally instructive than anything the nuns had provided. The nickname happened organically, the way the best nicknames do, which means it was probably mildly embarrassing at first and then impossible to escape. Kika Vu Coco was a popular comic song about a lost dog, which means that technically the most famous name in the history of fashion originated in a song about a missing pet. This is the sort of detail that Chanel, when older and considerably more composed, preferred not to dwell on. She accepted the nickname, internalized it, and eventually rebuilt it from the ground up until it meant something else entirely. That process of taking the raw material she had been given, whether it was a convent education, a provincial nickname, or a scrap of Jersey fabric, and transforming it into something with entirely different associations, is arguably the defining skill of her life. The cabaret years also gave her something more concrete: contact with men who had money and social mobility she did not yet have. She was young, striking in a way that was not conventional, and entirely unintimidated in a setting that intimidated most women of her background. It was in Moulins that she met Etienne Balsan, who would be the next chapter. It was there that the version of Coco Chanel who would eventually take Paris began assembling herself, piece by piece, in the back rooms of second-rate music halls, singing songs about a lost dog to rooms full of men who had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. The first great turning point in Coco's life arrived in the form of Etienne Balsan, wealthy, charming, and casually indifferent in the way that only men with horses and country estates can truly afford to be. Balsan was a textile heir who kept racehorses at his sprawling chateau at Royalieu, and somewhere around 1906, Coco became his companion, his house guest, and eventually his kept mistress, a fact she would later revise in her personal mythology. What Royalieu gave Chanel was not romance exactly, but something she needed far more: an education in how the rich actually lived. She watched, she absorbed, she noted every detail of their wardrobes, their manners, their magnificent ease, and she decided with characteristic bluntness that she could do it better. Royalieu was a world she'd never entered before, and she entered it without a map and without a safety net, which meant she had to navigate entirely by observation. She was sharply, precisely observant. She noticed that the women of Belson's circle, the actresses, the demi-mondaines, the well-kept women who populated the edges of wealthy men's lives, dressed in an elaborate ornamental style that now strikes us as ridiculous, but was then considered the pinnacle of fashion. They wore towering hats loaded with feathers. They wore corsets that compressed their organs into positions nature had not intended. They wore layers upon layers of fabric in the summer heat at race meetings, looking simultaneously magnificent and profoundly miserable. And they moved, to the extent they moved at all, with the careful, constrained gestures of people whose clothing had been specifically designed to prevent sudden decisions. Chanel looked at all of this and found it absurd. Not just aesthetically, practically absurd. These women could not ride, could not run, could barely sit down without a considered operation. Their entire physical existence had been subordinated to the demands of the silhouette they were required to maintain. And Coco, who had spent her formative years in coarse linen shifts, scrubbing floors and learning to work with her hands, found the whole arrangement deeply, personally offensive. Not to these women, she was charming to them. She was always charming when she needed to be, but to the idea of it. The idea that clothing was a cage and that the cage was called fashion. She began making her own hats, initially just to wear herself. They were simple, unadorned, and so strikingly different from the architectural constructions everyone around her was wearing that people asked about them. Belson's guests, his friends, his world, women with actual money and actual social standing, began asking where she had found them. She had made them. Could she make one for them? She could. And somewhere in that exchange the boutique began, not as a grand plan, but as a practical response to the gap between what was available and what she, and apparently others, actually wanted. Belson himself is a somewhat tragic footnote in the Chanel story. He provided the platform, the social access, and the context in which her talent first became visible, and he is remembered almost exclusively as a rung on her ladder. He was reportedly fond of her. She was fond of him in the way you're fond of someone who gave you exactly what you needed at exactly the right moment, which is a particular kind of fondness that does not necessarily survive the moment you no longer need it. When Boy Capel entered the picture, Belson became the past. The past, in Coco Chanel's experience, did not have a return policy. If Etienne Balsan was Coco's social education, Arthur Boy Capel was the emotional catastrophe that quietly shaped everything that followed. Capel was a British businessman, polo-playing, intellectually serious and utterly compelling, who met Chanel through Balsan's circle and promptly fell in love with her in the complicated, inconvenient way that people do when they shouldn't. He financed her first hat shop. He believed in her talent before anyone else thought to look for it. He was, by nearly every account, the love of her life. He was also, quite inconveniently, engaged to someone else, someone suitable, someone English, someone with the correct social credentials, and he married that someone in 1918. The following year, he died in a car accident on the road to Cannes. Coco was devastated in a way she never fully recovered from, even when she was very good at pretending otherwise. Boy Capel was unusual for his time and his class, which is probably why Chanel was so thoroughly undone by him. He was not merely rich and handsome. Plenty of men in that world were both. He was genuinely interested in ideas. He read philosophy. He was curious about Eastern thought at a time when that was considered eccentric rather than fashionable. He took Chanel's ambitions seriously, not as an indulgence or a charming hobby, but as a real enterprise worth backing with real money. He saw what she was building before there was much to see, and he invested in it without requiring her to diminish herself in exchange. This was not, in the context of 1910, a common arrangement. He also could not marry her. This was the fixed and immovable fact at the centre of everything. He could love her, support her, respect her, spend years of his life with her, but marriage was a social transaction that required participants with compatible backgrounds, and Gabrielle Chanel, orphanage raised, father abandoned without a birth certificate that told a respectable story, was not a compatible background. He married Diana Lister, a member of the English aristocracy in 1918, and by all accounts the marriage was not particularly warm on either side. Coco knew. She was hurt with the particular precision that comes from knowing something is coming for a long time before it arrives. Then, in December 1919, the telegram came. Boy Capel had died on the road between Cannes and Nice when his car's tyre burst and the vehicle overturned. He was 38 years old. Chanel, by her own account later in life, drove immediately to the site of the accident and sat in the dark on the roadside alone for a long time. When she spoke of him in old age to the writer Paul Morand, to others who managed to get past the performance long enough to reach the actual woman, her voice reportedly changed. The armour came off, briefly, and underneath it was someone who had simply never entirely recovered. She dressed his Paris apartment in black. She designed a black dress almost immediately afterward. Some biographers read this as the earliest ancestor of the little black dress, though the timeline is disputed. What is not disputed is that after Boy Capel died, Chanel never again organised her life around a single relationship in the same way. She had other men, many of them, some important, some less so, but she never again allowed anyone to hold the position he had held, whether this was grief or self-protection, or the particular pragmatism of a woman who had learned repeatedly that the people she loved tended to leave, is probably impossible to separate out. It was likely all of them, simultaneously, for the remaining 50 years of her life. In 1910, with Boy Capel's financial backing and the quiet ferocity of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, Gabrielle Chanel opened a small millinery shop at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris. She was selling hats, simple hats, stripped down, unadorned, almost aggressively unfussy hats, at a moment when respectable women's headwear in France looked like someone had glued an entire garden to the top of a fruit bowl. The contrast was so extreme it was almost a philosophical argument, and Parisian women, suffocating under pounds of feathers and silk flowers, took one look at Chanel's clean lines and quietly lost their minds with relief. The first shop was a modest success. It would not stay modest for long. Let's establish what the competition looked like, because without that context it is difficult to understand just how radical a simple hat actually was in 1910. The prevailing fashion in women's millinery at this period was enormous, truly, structurally enormous. Constructions that incorporated feathers, fruit, stuffed birds, ribbons, flowers both silk and dried, and occasionally netting in quantities that suggested the designer had never actually met a human head, and was working purely from theoretical principles. They were pinned into elaborate coiffures and required the wearer to move with the particular careful stillness of someone carrying something valuable on their head, which is precisely what they were doing. Chanel's hats required none of this. They were small, clean, and sat on the head in the way a hat is supposed to sit, as though it belongs there rather than as though it has arrived for a separate engagement. She was working with plain straw, simple ribbon, the occasional flower used sparingly rather than by the armful. The aesthetic was so contrary to everything around it that the first response from many women was reportedly confusion. And then, almost immediately after the confusion, relief. Because underneath the elaborate performance of Edwardian femininity, actual women with actual heads had been waiting for someone to give them permission to simplify, and Chanel gave it to them without asking anyone's permission first. The address, 21 Rue Cambon, would remain associated with Chanel for the rest of her life and well beyond it. The atelier would eventually move to 31 Rue Cambon, a few doors down, and it is still there today, still operating, still guarded by the particular reverence that accumulates around places where genuinely important things happened. There is something almost comic about the gap between the modest hat shop Chanel opened in 1910 and the global institution that address now represents. She was renting one room. She was selling hats. She could not have known what she was starting, which is perhaps just as well. If she had known, she might have been too frightened to begin. The clients came because the hats were beautiful in a new way. They came back because Chanel was exactly what she always was, absolutely certain. There was no equivocating, no perhaps you might prefer, no deferring to the customer's existing taste when that taste conflicted with her vision. She knew what she was doing, and she conveyed that knowledge in a way that made women trust her judgment over their own. This is incidentally the fundamental proposition of all great fashion, that the designer sees something the customer cannot yet see, and that the customer would like to live inside that vision. Chanel offered this from the very first hat. By the time she graduated from hats to clothes, the women of Paris were already following. By 1913, Coco had expanded to a boutique in the seaside resort town of Deauville, and this is where things began to accelerate. Deauville was where the wealthy French went to relax, which meant it was exactly where Chanel needed to be seen. She opened her shop, she put her designs in the window, and then something happened that no marketing budget could have bought. World War I began, and suddenly the elaborate ornamented fashion of the Belle Époque looked not just excessive, but frankly absurd. Women needed to move, women needed practicality, and there was Coco Chanel already there, already offering jersey fabrics and clean silhouettes, looking like a prophet who had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Deauville in the summer season was a concentration of exactly the kind of wealthy, fashionable, socially visible people Chanel needed access to. Horse racing, beach promenades, the particular leisure activities of those for whom leisure was a serious occupation. The boutique she opened there was small but deliberately positioned. She was not hiding in a side street. She was on the main promenade, in the flow of the people she wanted to dress, and she dressed herself in her own designs as the most effective possible advertisement. When people asked what she was wearing, she told them. When they asked where to get it, she pointed to the door behind her. The summer of 1914 was the last summer of the old world. The declaration of war in August scattered the fashionable resort crowds back to Paris and their country houses, and when the dust settled, everything had changed. The elaborate performances of pre-war femininity, the enormous hats, the laced corsets, the impossible trains, suddenly read as the costume of a world that no longer existed. Women were going to work. Women were driving ambulances and running farms and stepping into every role that the absent men had left behind. You cannot drive an ambulance in a corset. You cannot work a farm in a trained silk skirt. The fashion of the Belle Époque was not merely unfashionable after 1914. It was irrelevant. Chanel had not predicted this exactly. No one had predicted any of it, but she had already been moving in the direction the world was now forced to go. Her jersey pieces, her simple silhouettes, her emphasis on clothes that allowed the body to function rather than constraining it. All of it was suddenly not just aesthetically interesting but practically necessary. She was in the right place with the right product at the exact right moment, and she was sharp enough to understand that and move quickly. The Deauville boutique expanded. A third boutique followed in Biarritz. The clients multiplied. What had been a small, interesting hat shop had become, with extraordinary speed, the beginning of a real fashion house, and she was learning, constantly. Learning what worked on the body and what didn't. Learning how much simplicity was genius, and how much was just emptiness, a line she walked with careful precision throughout her career. Learning how to translate her instinct for what women actually needed into garments that women actually wanted to buy. The war, terrible as it was, gave Chanel the cultural conditions in which her particular vision could not just survive but dominate. By the time the armistice came in 1918, she was no longer a promising young milliner from the provinces. She was a significant force in French fashion, solvent and growing and entirely in charge of her own direction. The world had caught up with her. She was already moving ahead of it again. One of Chanel's most quietly radical decisions was her embrace of jersey, a knitted fabric that, before she got hold of it, was used primarily for men's underwear. This is not a metaphor. She literally took a fabric that men wore under their clothes and turned it into women's outerwear, and the fashion world somehow let her get away with it. Jersey draped beautifully, moved with the body, required no corset to hold it in shape, and cost a fraction of the silks and velvets her contemporaries were still insisting upon. Chanel's genius was never purely aesthetic. It was always also practical, always also a quiet commentary on what women actually needed their clothes to do, as opposed to what society had decided their clothes were for. The story of how Chanel came to Jersey varies slightly depending on which account you consult, but the most widely repeated version involves a cold day at Deauville and a borrowed pullover. Specifically, a pullover belonging to one of her male companions, which she belted and wore because she was cold and it was there. The women around her reportedly were fascinated, not by the garment itself, but by the way it moved with her, the way it did not fight the body or demand that the body accommodate it. It looked, in other words, comfortable. And in a world where women's fashion had been specifically engineered to look the opposite of comfortable, this was deeply interesting. She contacted Rodier, a French textile manufacturer who developed a knitted jersey fabric that was proving difficult to sell. Nobody wanted it. It was associated with workwear and underwear, and the functional, unglamorous world of men doing practical things. Chanel bought a large quantity of it at a reasonable price. She was always commercially sensible, another quality that separated her from many of her contemporaries, who were primarily artists rather than businesswomen, and she began experimenting with it. What she discovered was that jersey behaved differently from any fabric she had worked with before. It did not need structure imposed from outside. It had an inherent drape, an inherent relationship with the body's movement that made it do things that silk and wool and cotton could only approximate. The jersey designs she produced in the teens were revolutionary in a way that photographs from the period make difficult to convey, because they look relatively normal to modern eyes trained on a century of fashion that descended from Chanel's choices. But to the eye of 1915, a woman moving freely in a jersey suit, arms extended, stride unencumbered, no visible infrastructure of boning or padding or structure forcing her shape into compliance, looked like someone from a different century. Which, in a sense, she was. She was wearing the future. Everyone else was still dressed for the past. Chanel also borrowed freely from men's wardrobes in ways that went well beyond jersey. Sailor collars, trousers, blazers worn as outerwear. The vocabulary of male clothing, which had been evolving toward practicality and simplicity for decades because men were expected to move through the world doing things, became the source material from which she constructed a new aesthetic for women. The implication that women also move through the world doing things, and that their clothing should reflect this, was radical enough in 1915 that it required a certain amount of nerve to put it in a shop window. Chanel had nerve in extraordinary supply. She put it in the window, the women came, and the world turned, quietly and irreversibly in the direction she was pointing. While much of France was suffering through the First World War, Chanel opened a third boutique in Biarritz, the fashionable resort town on the Atlantic coast where Spanish aristocracy and wealthy neutrals still had money to spend, and no particular reason to stop spending it. It was an audacious move, and it paid off spectacularly. By the end of the war, Chanel had earned enough to repay Boy Capel every franc he had ever invested in her, a gesture that mattered enormously to her, not for any practical reason, but because she needed, on some cellular level, to owe nothing to anyone. The fortune she built during those years was the foundation upon which everything else was constructed, and she had built it entirely on her own terms, which was the only way she ever did anything. Biarritz was, in wartime terms, an anomaly. France was bleeding. The trenches of the Western Front were approximately 500 kilometres to the northeast, and the gap between that reality and the reality of Biarritz, warm Atlantic breezes, casino promenades, the elegant leisure of wealthy Spaniards and South Americans who had not entered the war, was so extreme as to be almost surreal. Chanel understood the anomaly and decided to inhabit it commercially rather than morally. She was not the only person in France making money from the fact that some people were insulated from the war's worst effects. She was simply more honest about the arithmetic. The Biarritz boutique was significantly larger than anything she had operated before. It employed around 300 people at its peak, seamstresses, assistants, fitters, a real operation run with the precision and relentlessness that would characterize every enterprise she ran for the rest of her life. She was not an absentee owner. She was there, in the workrooms, at the fitting sessions, with the pins and the fabric, making the decisions that mattered and an uncomfortable number of the decisions that didn't strictly require her attention, but which she made anyway because she did not entirely trust anyone else's judgment on anything she cared about. The clients were extraordinary by any standard. Spanish duchesses, South American heiresses, the kind of women who, in ordinary times, would have been dressing in Madrid and London and Buenos Aires, but who found themselves in Biarritz because Biarritz was neutral and accessible and had excellent weather. They had money, they had taste, and they had been told about this French designer who made clothes that were different from anything else available. They came in, they bought, they went home and told people. The word spread through the particular social networks of the very wealthy in the way it always has, person to person, in the right rooms, with the right emphasis, and the orders followed. By the armistice, Chanel had made what she herself described as a fortune. She repaid Capel. She reinvested. She was, at 35 years old, financially independent in a way that almost no woman of her generation and background had managed to become. Independent not because she had married well or inherited well, but because she had identified a need, filled it better than anyone else, and scaled the operation with commercial intelligence that her more artistically inclined competitors frequently lacked. The Biarritz years gave her not just money, but confidence of a particular bankable kind. The confidence of someone who has been proven right, not by a patron or a critic or a lover, but by a ledger. In 1921, Coco Chanel commissioned the perfumer Ernest Beau to create something unprecedented. A perfume that smelled like a woman rather than a flower. The result, a complex abstract composition built around aldehydes and jasmine, was presented to her in a series of numbered samples. She chose number 5, possibly because it was her lucky number, possibly because it was simply the best one, or possibly because Coco Chanel had an instinct for the iconic that bordered on the supernatural. She named it with austere simplicity Chanel number 5. She reportedly introduced it to clients by spraying it in her fitting rooms without comment, letting the fragrance speak before the brand did. It became, over the following century, the best-selling perfume in the world. Not one of them, the best-selling one. The brief Beau had been given was simple in statement and almost impossible in execution. Create a perfume that does not smell like a specific flower. Before Chanel No. 5, perfume was largely organised around single floral notes or simple combinations: rose, violet, lavender, jasmine, presented in ways that were identifiable and pleasant but not particularly complex. They smelled like gardens. Nice gardens, sometimes magnificent ones, but gardens nonetheless, something you could name, something with a clear referent in the natural world. Chanel wanted something that smelled like a person rather than a place, something warm and abstract and alive. Beau achieved this through the use of aldehydes, synthetic chemical compounds that give the fragrance its distinctive quality. The thing that is difficult to name but immediately recognizable as Chanel No. 5 rather than anything else. The aldehydes are what make it sparkle and lift, what give it the clean, almost metallic brightness at the top before the deeper floral heart settles. They are also, in quantities greater than Beau used, deeply unpleasant, which means the formula required extraordinary precision. He got it right in the 5th sample. She chose it. She named it after its sample number, and she refused to make it more complicated than that. The number stayed. The simplicity stayed. Everything about the presentation, the clean rectangular bottle, the minimal black and white label, was as stripped back and decisive as the perfume itself. The commercial structure she built around it was, in its own way, as remarkable as the fragrance. She partnered with the Wertheimer family, who had the manufacturing and distribution infrastructure to take a perfume from a boutique product to a global one. This partnership would become one of the most financially significant and most contentious business relationships of her life. In the short term, it made her rich, and it made Chanel No. 5 available everywhere rather than only to the women who visited Rue Cambon. By the 1930s, it was being sold in department stores across Europe and America. By the 1940s, it was so deeply embedded in the culture that when American soldiers asked Parisian shopkeepers what to bring home to their wives and mothers, the answer was almost universally the same: Chanel No. 5. It was the perfume of liberation in the most literal possible sense. A bottle of something that smelled like a woman, chosen because there was nothing else quite like it, carried home across an ocean as proof that Paris still existed and was still, despite everything, itself. In 1926, Chanel published a design in American Vogue that would go on to be described as the fashion equivalent of the Ford Model T: democratic, versatile, available to everyone. The little black dress. It sounds simple now because the little black dress is so thoroughly embedded in the culture that we have forgotten it had to be invented. Before Chanel, black was what you wore to funerals and to signal grief. It was the colour of absence. Chanel took it and turned it into a canvas, a neutral, elegant, endlessly adaptable foundation for a woman's wardrobe, and in doing so, she dismantled centuries of social coding about what mourning looked like and who got to decide. The Vogue editorial that introduced it to America did not describe it as revolutionary. It described it with the particular cool confidence of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at, as the frock that all the world will wear. This was either remarkable prescience or very good marketing copy, and it turned out to be both. The dress itself was simple to the point of austerity, short, straight, long-sleeved, with almost no ornamentation. It fit close to the body without clinging. It ended at the knee, which was still a relatively modern hemline, and it was black, entirely, without apology, without a contrasting trim or a flash of colour to soften the statement. To understand why this was startling, you have to understand what black meant in 1926. Queen Victoria had worn mourning dress for 40 years after the death of Prince Albert, and her example had codified, across the English-speaking world and beyond it, an entire grammar of grief expressed through clothing. Black was for widows, black was for funerals, black was for the publicly bereaved. Wearing black in ordinary social circumstances was not just unfashionable, it was a statement about your personal life that you probably did not intend to make. Chanel took this grammar and quietly set it on fire. She was well acquainted with black by this point. She had dressed in it after Boy Capel died. She'd grown up with it in the convent corridors of Aubusine. She had an eye trained on the aesthetic of absence, on the way black simplified and clarified, on how it focused the eye on the person wearing it rather than the clothing itself. A woman in a little black dress is the subject of the picture. A woman in an elaborate floral silk is competing with her own outfit for the viewer's attention. Chanel always believed the woman should win that competition, and black was the most efficient way to ensure it. The democratizing element was equally intentional. The little black dress could be made in inexpensive fabric and still look correct. It could be dressed up with jewellery or worn plain. It could be worn by a duchess or a shop girl, and if both were standing in a room together, you might not immediately know which was, of course, precisely the point. Chanel had always been irritated by the way expensive fashion announced its own price, by the way wealth wrote itself in ruffles and embroidery across the bodies of the women who wore it. A dress that levelled that field, even partially, was both aesthetically satisfying to her and personally gratifying. American Vogue's comparison to the Ford Model T was more precise than it might have appeared. Henry Ford's great insight had been that a useful, well-designed object should be available to as many people as possible, and that availability did not have to mean ugliness. Chanel's insight was the same, applied to a different problem. The little black dress is still, a century later, the first thing most women reach for when they do not know what to wear and need to get it right. That is not a trend. That is a solution. In the late 1920s, Coco Chanel was in a relationship with the second Duke of Westminster, one of the wealthiest men in England, a man who owned so much property that you could walk from one end of his estates to the other and require several meals and a good night's sleep. He reportedly asked her to marry him. She declined. She's alleged to have said in one of the most ice-cold responses in the history of romantic rejection that there are several Duchesses of Westminster, but only one Coco Chanel. Whether she actually said exactly that is debated. That it sounds precisely like something she would say is not debated at all. Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, known to his friends as Bendor, was by 1926 one of the most eligible and most exhausting men in Europe. He was immensely rich. The Grosvenor family owned significant portions of central London, among other things, and the income from this was the kind of income that made other wealthy people feel briefly insecure about their own finances. He was also twice divorced, compulsively unfaithful, passionate about salmon fishing and yachting, and possessed of the particular quality that very powerful men sometimes have of assuming that the world will organise itself around their preferences, because it always had before. Chanel met him in Monte Carlo in the winter of 1925, likely through the Duke of Westminster's social circle, which overlapped at multiple points with hers. He was immediately captivated. He pursued her with the focused energy that men of his class and temperament brought to whatever they decided they wanted, and what he wanted, with increasing clarity, was Coco Chanel. He sent her enormous quantities of flowers. He gave her jewellery that would have caused most women to reconsider any philosophical objections they might have had. He invited her onto his yacht, the Flying Cloud, one of the largest private yachts in the world, and took her fishing, which she reportedly approached with the same decisive competence she brought to everything else. The relationship lasted several years and was conducted across an extraordinary geography: his Scottish estates, his yacht in the Mediterranean, his house in France, the London properties. Chanel moved through this world with her characteristic composure, wearing her own designs among women who were wearing everyone else's, holding her own in rooms full of English aristocracy who had no particular framework for what she was. She was not a great lady. She was not a mistress in the traditional sense. She was something the social taxonomy of the English upper class had not fully prepared itself for. A self-made woman of no family and immense achievement, being courted by one of the most titled men in the country, on terms she was setting herself. The proposal, when it came, was presumably genuine. Westminster had a history of marriage. He would go on to marry twice more after Chanel, and there is no reason to doubt that he wanted her specifically and formally. What he could not have fully understood, even after years of knowing her, was that marriage to him would have required her to become the Duchess of Westminster. And the Duchess of Westminster was a role with a job description, a social position, a set of obligations and appearances and carefully managed public identities, all of which would have required Coco Chanel to become secondary to a title rather than primary to a name. She had spent her entire life building the name. She was not going to file it behind a title now, regardless of how large the estates were. There have been many Duchesses of Westminster. There has been, as she noted, only one Coco Chanel. She was correct on both counts. Chanel did not operate in isolation. In the 1920s, she moved through one of the most extraordinary artistic circles the 20th century produced, and she moved through it not as an admiring observer, but as an equal. She was friends with Pablo Picasso, who was not easy to be friends with. She worked with Igor Stravinsky, financed his early efforts in Paris, and possibly had an affair with him, a detail that would make The Rite of Spring considerably more interesting to listen to. She collaborated with the impresario Sergei Diaghilev and his Ballet Russe, designing costumes for productions that were genuinely changing what art looked like. She was not decorating the margins of modernism. She was in the room where it was happening, and she had opinions. Paris in the 1920s was one of those rare historical moments when an unusual concentration of talent, money, freedom, and mutual influence produced something larger than the sum of its parts. Picasso was painting in Montparnasse. Stravinsky was composing. Cocteau was writing. Hemingway and Fitzgerald were Americans in love with the city's particular chaos. Diaghilev's Ballet Russe was producing work that fused dance, music, visual art, and costume design into an entirely new kind of theatrical experience. And Coco Chanel, who had grown up in a convent sewing room and performed in provincial cabarets, was in the middle of all of it, not as a patron at a respectful distance, but as a collaborator with skin in the game. Her connection to the Ballet Russe began through Monsieur Certes, who had been Diaghilev's great friend and advocate for years. Chanel was introduced to Diaghilev, recognized immediately what he was doing, and began supporting him financially, most significantly by bankrolling the revival of The Rite of Spring in 1920, which had famously caused a riot at its premiere in 1913, and which Diaghilev wanted to return to the stage with the full force of its original vision. Chanel provided the money quietly, without attaching her name to it in a way that would have required Diaghilev to give her public credit. She understood the dynamics of artistic pride well enough to know that a gift which came with no strings attached was more likely to be accepted than one that came with a plaque. Her relationship with Stravinsky is more complicated and more contested. He and his family stayed at her villa at Garches for a period in the early 1920s, and the proximity, combined with the intensity of their mutual admiration, led biographers and later a novelist to conclude that there was an affair. The evidence is not conclusive. What is clear is that they respected each other's work with the particular focused attention of people who recognized a kindred discipline, the insistence on getting it right, the refusal to be sentimental about cutting what wasn't working, the understanding that simplicity was harder to achieve than complexity and more worth achieving. Whether anything else passed between them, their professional admiration was entirely real and entirely mutual. Picasso sketched her more than once. Cocteau adored her and wrote about her with the particular breathless enthusiasm of someone who found her as much a work of art as a person. She moved through their world without being consumed by it, which was not easy. The artistic circles of 20s Paris had a centripetal force that pulled people into dependency and excess with considerable efficiency. Chanel kept her balance. She listened. She contributed. She gave money when she had it, an opinion when it was asked for, and she went home to Rue Cambon and kept working. The modernists gave her context and inspiration. She gave them financial support, costume designs, and the sight of a woman who was building something every bit as new as what they were building, in a medium they had not quite thought to take seriously. It was by any measure a fair exchange. If there was one person in the fashion world who genuinely got under Coco Chanel's famously composed exterior, it was the Italian designer Elsa Schiaparelli, and the feeling by most accounts was thoroughly mutual. Where Chanel was disciplined, restrained, and classically elegant, Schiaparelli was surrealist, theatrical, and delightfully absurd. She collaborated with Salvador Dali to produce, among other things, a hat shaped like a high-heeled shoe, which is either genius or insanity, and probably both. Chanel reportedly referred to her rival as that Italian woman who makes clothes, which when delivered in Chanel's particular register was not a compliment. Their decade-long battle for dominance over French fashion was one of the great sustained grudge matches in the history of style. Schiaparelli arrived in Paris in the 1920s and established her house in the early 30s, timing her emergence precisely as Chanel's dominance was at its most complete, which either took considerable nerve or considerable obliviousness, and Schiaparelli was too intelligent to be oblivious. Her aesthetic was the photographic negative of Chanel's. Where Chanel stripped away and simplified, Schiaparelli added, elaborated, and provoked. She was deeply embedded in the Surrealist movement. Her friendships with Dali, Man Ray, and Jean Cocteau were not merely social, they were genuinely collaborative, producing designs that treated the body as a canvas for ideas rather than a form to be elegantly clothed. The lobster dress, the shoe hat, a jacket with lips as pockets, a skeleton dress with padded ribs. These were not clothes in the conventional sense, they were arguments. Chanel found this frivolous, or said she did. Her own work was always grounded in the body's practical relationship to the world. A Chanel garment was meant to be worn, to move, to work, to live in. A Schiaparelli piece was meant to be seen, discussed, and in several cases probably not sat down in. The philosophical gap between them was real, and it was wide, and both women were sharp enough to understand that it was not merely aesthetic. It was a disagreement about what fashion was for. Was it a functional art form in service of the woman wearing it? Or was it a fine art form in service of an idea that the woman was asked to embody? They were never going to agree on this, and they never did. The personal dimension sharpened the professional one. They competed for the same clients, the same press, the same cultural oxygen. When Schiaparelli introduced a shocking pink, the intense, aggressive fuchsia that became her signature colour, it landed as everything Chanel's palette was not. Loud, demanding, impossible to overlook. When Chanel's client base began experimenting with Schiaparelli's surrealist pieces, Chanel is said to have been more than usually pointed in her opinions about women who wore things designed to make them look ridiculous. When Schiaparelli's name began appearing in American Vogue with a frequency that rivaled Chanel's own, the coldness between them reportedly dropped several degrees further. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, of Chanel appearing at a party in a highly flammable dress and standing too close to a candle, which caught the dress briefly alight. Some accounts suggest the incident was not entirely accidental. Whether or not you believe this says a great deal about your general view of what ambitious women in close competition are capable of. What is not in doubt is that the rivalry produced on both sides some of the most significant fashion of the 1930s, each designer pushing against the other's position, each defining herself partly in opposition to what the other stood for. Fashion has always needed its contrary forces. In the 30s, Chanel and Schiaparelli were the best argument it had. Perhaps the most enduring thing Coco Chanel did, more than any single garment or perfume, was methodically dismantle the architecture of constraint that had been built around the female body over the previous century. She shortened hemlines, she eliminated the corset, she cut women's hair, introduced trousers into women's wardrobes, and stripped the unnecessary ornamentation from every surface she could reach. Each decision was, on its face, practical. Taken together, they added up to something closer to a manifesto. Chanel never called herself a feminist. She had complicated and often contradictory views on women and what they should want, but she did believe, with absolute consistency, that women's clothing should allow women to function as human beings, which in 1915 was a more radical position than it sounds. The corset is the place to begin, because the corset is the most honest symbol of what Chanel was dismantling. It was a garment designed to reshape the body into a shape the body did not naturally have, to compress the waist, lift the bosom, and create the S-curve silhouette that the Edwardian era had decided was the correct configuration for a female form. It was, by most accounts of women who wore them, uncomfortable in ordinary circumstances and genuinely dangerous in others. Fainting was not, in the Edwardian era, exclusively a social performance. It was frequently a physiological consequence of wearing something that restricted breathing. Women who wore corsets could not fully inflate their lungs. They could not run. They could not in many cases dress or undress without assistance. Chanel did not invent the movement away from the corset. Paul Poiret had been working in the same direction before the war, though his motives and aesthetics were quite different from hers. But she was the one who made the alternative not just available, but desirable, which is the harder thing. Telling women the corset was bad for them was not enough. They already knew that. Showing them that the uncorseted body could be elegantly clothed, that freedom of movement could coexist with style, that the price of physical comfort was not aesthetic compromise, that was the argument that changed behaviour. The hemline was the other great battle. Women's skirts had swept the floor for centuries, raising them first to the ankle, then to the calf, then to the knee over the course of the teens and 20s was not merely a fashion change. It was a renegotiation of what parts of a woman's body were available to public view, and by extension of what women were permitted to do in public spaces. You cannot stride purposefully in a floor-length skirt. You cannot bicycle. You cannot, without considerable drama, board a bus. The raised hemline was a practical accommodation to a world in which women were moving faster and covering more ground. and Chanel understood this with the instinctive clarity of someone who had always needed to move fast and cover ground herself. Trousers for women, which she wore publicly and designed commercially from relatively early in her career, were a more direct provocation. Women did not wear trousers in polite society in 1915. They simply did not. Chanel wore them anyway, on the beach at Deauville, on Balsan's estate, on Westminster's yacht, partly because they were practical for the activities involved, and partly because the reaction they produced told her exactly what she needed to know about which rules were worth following. The rules that made people genuinely angry, she observed, were usually the rules that mattered, and the ones that mattered were the ones worth breaking first. In 1939, Chanel closed her couture house. She cited the approaching war, though the full story was considerably more tangled. She retreated to the Ritz, where she lived for much of the following decade, and fashion moved on without her, moved toward the structured, padded, extravagant silhouettes of Christian Dior's new look, which arrived in 1947 and took the world entirely by surprise. Then, in 1954, at the age of 71, Coco Chanel decided she was not finished. She reopened her atelier. The first collection was reviewed badly, brutally in France, where the fashion press received her return with the warmth of a particularly cold January. In America and Britain, the reviews were rather better. Within 2 years, the world had come back around to her. The closing of the house in 1939 was not purely about the war, though the war was the publicly stated reason, and was not entirely fictional as reasons go. There were other factors, the strikes and labour disputes of the late 1930s, which Chanel had handled with characteristic bluntness and very little diplomatic grace. The changing fashion landscape, in which designers like Madeleine Vionnet and Cristobal Balenciaga were producing work of extraordinary sophistication that occupied adjacent territory. And perhaps beneath all of it, the simple fact that she'd been doing this for 30 years and was tired in a way that the wartime disruption made it convenient to acknowledge. She closed the workrooms. She let the staff go. She kept her apartment at the Ritz and her opinions about everything, which never required staff. Then Dior arrived. The new look of 1947, padded shoulders, nipped waists, enormous skirts that fell to mid-calf, was received in much of the fashion world as a glorious return to femininity after years of wartime austerity. Women who had spent the war in utility clothing wept, reportedly, at the extravagance of it. Chanel, watching from her Ritz apartment, described it in terms that were considerably less reverential. She saw in the new look everything she had spent her career dismantling: the constrained waist, the impractical volume, the suggestion that women's clothing should celebrate their decorative function rather than accommodate their active one. She was furious. She was also, by this point, 70 years old and widely considered finished. The 1954 reopening was her answer to that conclusion. She reportedly told people she was bored, which was almost certainly true, but the deeper motivation was the one it always was with Chanel. She believed she was right, and she intended to prove it. The first collection landed in February. The Paris press eviscerated it. They called it old-fashioned, regressive, a relic. They compared it unfavourably to Dior and Balenciaga, and the structured modernity of what French fashion had become in her absence. She read the reviews, apparently without visible distress. Then she waited. The American magazines, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, were more measured and then more enthusiastic. American buyers, who were dressing working women rather than Parisian socialites, saw in the Chanel collection exactly what they had been looking for: clothes that were elegant and practical, and designed for bodies that had things to do. The orders came from New York, from Chicago, from the American department stores that had the commercial reach to make a designer's reputation in ways that Paris press notices could not. Within 2 seasons, the narrative had reversed. Within 5 years, Chanel was not a comeback story. She was, again, the dominant force in international fashion. She had been away for 15 years, and she had come back and won, at 71, without apologising for a single thing, This is the chapter that Chanel's admirers have always preferred to discuss quickly and then move on from, and the one her critics have returned to with considerable persistence. During the German occupation of Paris in World War II, Chanel lived at the Hotel Ritz, which was also, not coincidentally, the headquarters of the German High Command. She had a relationship with a German officer, Hans Günther von Dinklage, known as Spatz, who was significantly younger than she was and connected to German military intelligence. There is also evidence that Chanel was in contact with German intelligence services herself, operating under the codename Westminster, the same name as the Duke who had once proposed to her, which is either darkly ironic or an extraordinary coincidence. The full extent of her wartime activities remains a matter of historical debate. The occupation of Paris began in June 1940, and the Hotel Ritz was requisitioned almost immediately as accommodation for senior German officers and officials. That Chanel remained there was, in itself, unremarkable. The Ritz continued to house a mixed population of French citizens, foreign nationals and German officers throughout the occupation, and residency did not automatically imply collaboration. What distinguished Chanel's situation was the nature and depth of her engagement with the occupying forces, which went considerably beyond cohabitation. Von Dinklage, Spatz, was not a simple military officer who happened to be stationed in Paris. He was connected to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and had been operating in France in various capacities before the occupation began. His relationship with Chanel was personal and extended, lasting several years. Whether she understood the full dimensions of his intelligence work, whether she cared, and whether she considered the political implications of the relationship are questions that the historical record does not answer with complete clarity. What it does suggest is that she did not consider them sufficient reason to end it. The intelligence file is more disturbing. Documents uncovered after the war indicate that Chanel was recruited as an agent, designated F7124, operating under the codename Westminster. There is evidence of at least one mission, an attempt in 1943, coordinated through Spanish diplomatic channels, to open back-channel communications between Germany and Winston Churchill, whom Chanel knew personally from her years in British aristocratic circles. The mission, known as Operation Model Hat, which has a grim humour to it, does not appear to have succeeded. Whether it was sincere or whether Chanel was using the intelligence apparatus for her own purposes, which at that point included the ongoing attempt to dispossess the Wertheimers, is something historians continue to argue about. What all of this adds up to is a picture of a woman who navigated the occupation with the same pragmatic self-interest she had brought to every other chapter of her life, who made the choices that preserved her comfort, advanced her interests, and kept her close to power, without apparent concern for the moral weight of the machinery she was adjacent to. This does not make her unique among Parisians of her class and position during the occupation. It does make her culpable in ways that the perfume bottle does not acknowledge, and that any honest account of her life cannot ignore. The wartime period brought out what many historians consider Chanel's least flattering quality: her willingness to use whatever leverage was available to her, including the machinery of Nazi anti-Jewish legislation, to settle old business disputes. The Wertheimer family, Jewish industrialists who had held a controlling stake in the commercial rights to Chanel No. 5 since the 1920s, had long been a source of frustration to Coco. Under the occupation's anti-Jewish laws, she attempted to wrest control of the perfume business away from them by arguing it should be Aryanized. The Wertheimers, having anticipated exactly this kind of move, had already transferred ownership of the company on paper to a French industrialist. They survived, the company survived, and the business relationship was eventually reconstituted after the war. Chanel got nothing. The episode is not a footnote, it is a significant part of the record. The backstory requires a brief detour to 1924. When Chanel No. 5 was ready for commercial production and distribution, at a scale beyond what her boutique could handle, she needed a manufacturing and business partner with industrial capacity. Théophile Wertheimer and his sons Pierre and Paul had that capacity. They controlled Bourgeois, one of the largest perfume and cosmetics companies in France, with production facilities, distribution networks, and the commercial infrastructure to take a perfume from a couture boutique to international department stores. The deal they struck gave the Wertheimers 70% of the profits from Chanel No. 5. Chanel received 10%. Her introducer, the businessman Théophile Bader, received 20%. Chanel had agreed to this at the time. She would spend the rest of her life being irritated by it. 10% of the profits from the best-selling perfume in the world is not a negligible sum by any standard, but the arithmetic of the arrangement that the Wertheimers were making 7 times what she was making from her own creation, grated in a way that did not diminish with the passing years. She had been, she felt, taken advantage of at a moment when she needed the deal more than they did, and the memory of that power imbalance did not leave her. When the occupation began, and the Vichy government's anti-Jewish legislation made it legally possible to seize or Aryanize businesses owned by Jewish families, Chanel moved to use that mechanism against the Wertheimers. The legal argument she advanced was that the perfume business was Jewish-owned and should therefore be transferred to Aryan control, specifically her control. This was not a spontaneous response to wartime chaos. It was a deliberate, calculated legal action, using the apparatus of racial persecution as a business instrument. The distinction between opportunism and active collaboration is one that historians continue to draw and redraw, but the fact of the attempt is not disputed. The Wertheimers survived it. Pierre Wertheimer had read the situation early enough before the occupation, before the legislation, to arrange a paper transfer of the company to a French industrialist named Félix Amiot, who had no Jewish heritage and therefore no legal vulnerability under Vichy law. When Chanel's claim arrived, there was nothing to Aryanize. The company was already, on paper, in French hands. After the war, the transfer was reversed. The Wertheimers reclaimed full ownership, and in a final irony that Chanel must have found genuinely maddening, they eventually bought out her share of the perfume entirely, paying her a settlement that, while significant, was considerably less than continued participation would have earned her. They were by any measure better at business than she was. She had created the perfume. They had saved it from her. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, the settling of accounts began almost immediately, and Coco Chanel found herself summoned for questioning by the French authorities investigating collaboration. She was held briefly, then released. The circumstances of her release have never been fully clarified. Some historians point to the intervention of Winston Churchill, whom Chanel had known personally through her social connections with the British aristocracy, though the exact nature of his involvement, if any, is disputed. What is certain is that she was released, that no charges were brought, and that she subsequently removed herself to Switzerland, where she remained in self-imposed exile for the better part of a decade. Paris was not, in those years, entirely comfortable for people who had lived at the Ritz. The liberation of Paris was accompanied by a period of public reckoning, l'épuration, the purge, in which French citizens accused of collaboration were arrested, tried, and in some cases executed. Women who'd had relationships with German officers were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, marched through the streets as a form of collective punishment that said a great deal about how French society had decided to distribute blame for the occupation's compromises. These were not always or even primarily the most culpable collaborators. They were frequently the most visible, the most vulnerable, the easiest to make an example of. The industrialists and officials who had run French businesses under German supervision, who had supplied the German war machine, who had signed the orders, many of them moved through the liberation's reckoning with considerably less public drama. Chanel was summoned to the Hotel Ritz, now requisitioned by the liberating forces rather than the occupying ones, for questioning by the French intelligence service. The interrogation was conducted by an officer, and by most accounts it was serious rather than perfunctory. She had a German lover. There were the intelligence files. There was the Wertheimer business. There was the general fact of her continued residence at the Ritz throughout the occupation, her evident comfort, her social ease with the people who were running the city into the ground. These were not trivial matters, and then she was released. The questions around this have never been entirely answered. The Churchill connection, the fact that Chanel had known Churchill through Westminster's social circle, that she had apparently been in contact with British intelligence at some point during Operation Model Hut, that Churchill himself was alive and powerful and possibly not uninterested in what Chanel might say publicly if pushed, have led historians to suggest that British pressure, official or unofficial, played a role. The French authorities may simply have decided for reasons of evidence or politics or both that the case was not worth pursuing. What is clear is that she walked out of the Ritz within hours and kept walking, all the way to Switzerland, where she settled in Lausanne and began the long, quiet project of waiting for the world to forget, or at least to move on. The years Coco Chanel spent in Switzerland, roughly from 1945 to 1954, are among the least documented of her life, which is saying something for a woman who spent decades constructing her own mythology with extraordinary care. She settled in Lausanne, living quietly by her standards, which still means considerably more elaborately than most people's standards. She was not entirely alone. Von Dinkelig joined her for a period, though that relationship too eventually wound down. She read, she observed, she presumably simmered. By all accounts, she found exile deeply disagreeable and the Swiss deeply boring, which, given her previous decades, is entirely understandable. She had not, as some assumed, retired. She was waiting. Lausanne was not, in the late 1940s, a city associated with fashion, culture, or any of the things Coco Chanel had spent her life immersed in. It was clean, orderly, discreet, and neutral, which was precisely why it attracted the post-war exile community of people who needed to be somewhere that did not ask too many questions. Chanel was in good and thoroughly uncomfortable company. The Switzerland of this period was full of people whose wartime choices had made the cities of Western Europe temporarily inhospitable, which meant it was also full of the particular kind of social awkwardness that attends communities of the compromised. She had money enough, from the Wertheimer settlement and her personal savings, to live with the comfort she required and considered non-negotiable. She had her health, which at 62 was rather better than she had any right to expect given the pace and intensity of her previous 6 decades. What she did not have was purpose, which for Chanel was not a philosophical lack but a practical one. She was a person defined entirely by what she was building, and in Switzerland there was nothing to build. The atelier was closed. Rue Cambon was shuttered. The workrooms were dark. Von Dinkelig was there for a time, but the relationship had a quality of mutual convenience that did not survive the removal of the circumstances that had created it. In Paris, during the occupation, he had represented access to safety and comfort and the proximity to power that Chanel always sought. In Lausanne, in exile, he was simply a man she had known under difficult circumstances, considerably younger than her, without resources of his own, without the social context that had made him interesting. The relationship faded. He departed. She stayed. The 9 years in Switzerland are sometimes presented as a void in the Chanel story, as the gap between the wartime controversy and the triumphant comeback, as though she were merely waiting rather than existing. But she was existing with considerable intensity, even if the evidence of it is sparse. She was observing what fashion was doing in her absence. She was watching Dior's new look land and reading the reviews and forming opinions that grew sharper with every passing season. She was preparing, not consciously perhaps, not with a specific plan, but in the way that people with very strong convictions prepare when the world is busy being wrong. Eventually, as it always did with Chanel, the waiting became intolerable. She went back. She was right too. When Chanel reopened her salon in February 1954 and showed her first collection in 15 years, the Paris fashion establishment responded with something approaching contempt. The reviews in the French press were savage. One critic called it a fiasco. Others suggested she was offering a nostalgic rehash of pre-war ideas in a world that had moved on. They were not entirely wrong about the collection's influences. Chanel was, as always, returning to her own principles rather than chasing a new trend. What the critics missed, and what became clear within 18 months, was that women across the world, working women, American women, women who needed to move and function and still look extraordinary, disagreed with Paris entirely. The world came to Chanel. Paris eventually followed. The February showing took place at 31 Rue Cambon, in the salon above the boutique, with its mirrored staircase and its particular atmosphere of concentrated seriousness. Chanel had spent months preparing. She had been back in the workrooms, pinning and cutting and adjusting with the same physical precision she had always brought to the craft. Working with a small team reassembled from the old atelier and new staff who had never worked with her before, and were learning at considerable speed what working with her actually meant. What it meant was that nothing was finished until she said it was finished, that her eye was the final authority on every hem and every seam, and that the distance between her standard and acceptable was not a negotiable quantity. The collection itself was recognisably Chanel, jersey, clean lines, the cardigan jacket that would evolve into the definitive Chanel suit, the absence of the structured padding and dramatic silhouette that Dior had made fashionable. To the Paris press, trained on 7 years of the new look and its successors, it looked like a step backward. They were not entirely wrong that it was a rejection of where fashion had gone. They were entirely wrong that this was a problem. The question was not whether Chanel was offering something new by the standards of 1954 Paris. The question was whether she was offering something true, something that corresponded to an actual need in the bodies and lives of actual women. And the answer to that question came not from the Parisian critics, but from the buyers. The American magazines saw it differently from the start. Bettina Ballard at American Vogue and Carmel Snow at Harper's Bazaar both understood what they were looking at, understood that the American market, which was dressing secretaries and executives and women who drove their own cars and sat through their own meetings, was waiting for exactly this. The orders that followed the American coverage reversed the narrative with a completeness that must have been satisfying to Chanel in a way she was too composed to fully display. By the following season, the Paris press had discovered reasons to reconsider. By 1957, Time magazine put her on its cover. By 1958, the comeback was not a comeback anymore. It was simply the present tense. What the episode reveals, more than anything else, is the particular geography of Chanel's talent. She was not a designer who worked from the outside in, who looked at what the world wanted and produced a version of it. She worked from the inside out, from a set of fixed convictions about what clothing was for and what women needed, and she trusted those convictions over trend, over critical consensus, over the collective opinion of an entire fashion establishment that had declared her finished. She had been right before when the world said she was wrong. She was right again. The critics who savaged the February collection were, within 2 years, writing about her as though they had recognised her genius all along. She did not, as far as the record shows, correct them. She simply kept working. Among the things Chanel produced in her second act, none became more globally influential than the Chanel suit, the collarless, braided trim, cardigan-style jacket worn with a matching A-line skirt. It was first shown in various forms in the mid-1950s and refined obsessively over the following years. It was practical without being plain. It was elegant without requiring the wearer to stop breathing. It could be dressed up or down with a change of jewellery, worn to a board meeting or a lunch, and it held its structure across decades in a way that genuinely transcendent design tends to do. Copies appeared in department stores around the world within seasons. Imitation was, as usual, the sincerest form of flattery, and Chanel, who had herself borrowed freely from men's tailoring and workwear, had very little standing to object. The suit's construction was deceptively complex. The jacket, which looks simple in photographs and looks simple on the body, is an engineering achievement of a particular kind, one that hides its difficulty behind apparent effortlessness in exactly the way Chanel always demanded her clothes should. The collarless neckline required precise cutting to sit flat against the body without pulling or gaping. The braid trim, applied along the edges of the jacket, the sleeves, the pockets, was not merely decorative. It added weight to the fabric, helping the jacket hang correctly and move with the body rather than against it. The lining was often weighted at the hem for the same reason. Every decision was functional, and the function produced the elegance rather than competing with it. The skirt was equally considered. The A-line cut that became standard allowed the wearer to sit, stand, stride, and climb stairs without the fabric pulling or riding up, simple requirements that a surprising amount of fashion of the period failed to meet. The skirt was designed to move with the body rather than constraining it, which put it in direct continuity with everything Chanel had been doing since the jersey pieces of 1915. 40 years on, the principle was identical. The execution had simply been refined to its most precise and reproducible form. Jackie Kennedy wore the Chanel suit, or a copy of it, since the Kennedy family was purchasing American-made versions rather than Paris originals, with a frequency that turned it into an international symbol of a particular kind of modern elegance. The image of her in the pink Chanel suit on the day of President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 is one of the most searing photographs of the 20th century, and the suit is part of what makes it so. The composed, devastating combination of beauty and horror, the colour against the circumstance, the garment that was designed to make a woman look her most capable worn on the day that capability meant nothing at all. Copies arrived in every price point and every market almost simultaneously with the originals. Chanel was reportedly aware of this, and reportedly not particularly disturbed by it. She had, after all, always believed that good design should be available to as many people as possible, and the little black dress had set that precedent 3 decades earlier. The copies meant the silhouette spread. The silhouette spreading meant the vocabulary of the suit became universal. Today, the collarless braided jacket is so embedded in the grammar of professional women's clothing that many of the women wearing versions of it have no idea they are wearing a Chanel design. That is the ultimate achievement of useful design. It disappears into the taken for granted, becomes part of the air. Chanel would have considered this a compliment of the highest order. Over the course of her life, Coco Chanel had a series of relationships with wealthy, powerful, often married men, and the pattern, if you step back far enough to see it clearly, is remarkably consistent. The men provided financial stability, social access, and creative support. Chanel provided intensity, originality, and the particular thrill of a woman who was clearly never going to be possessed. When the relationship had given her what she needed, or when it became clear that it would not give her what she actually wanted, which was, in at least a few cases, genuine commitment, it ended. Sometimes she ended it, sometimes they did. What did not change was her refusal, after the death of Boy Capel, to organise her life around any man's convenience rather than her own. This was unusual enough in her era to be worth noting. The sequence runs something like this. Balsan provided the social education and the first glimpse of the world she intended to inhabit. Capel provided the emotional foundation and the financial backing that made the first shops possible, and then he died, and something in Chanel's architecture shifted permanently. Westminster provided access to the British aristocracy, to the yacht and the salmon rivers, and the particular quality of ease that comes with multi-generational wealth, and she engaged with all of it with evident pleasure, and declined the one thing he was actually offering: the title, the permanence, the absorption into his identity rather than her own. Then there was the Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, cousin of the last Tsar, who arrived in Chanel's life in the early 1920s, trailing the particular tragedy of the Russian imperial family and a deep familiarity with the aesthetics of pre-revolutionary Russian court culture. Their relationship was brief but productive in ways that went beyond the personal. The Russian influence on Chanel's work in this period is visible in the embroidery, the Byzantine jewellery, the Slavic references that appeared in her collections of the early 20s. He introduced her to Russian craftsmen and artists who had fled the revolution and settled in Paris, many of whom she employed. He gave her a new visual vocabulary. She used it. The relationship ran its course, as they tended to. Paul Iribe, The French illustrator and designer came later, 1930s, a relationship that seemed, for a period, as though it might become something more permanent than the others. He was creatively aligned with her in ways that earlier partners had not been, genuinely interested in design and aesthetics, capable of engaging with her work as a peer rather than an admirer from a distance. He died of a heart attack in 1935 at Chanel's tennis court at La Pausa, her villa on the French Riviera. The loss was real. She did not discuss it publicly in the way she did not discuss most things that genuinely affected her, which is to say, she discussed it in the compressed, controlled way that people discuss things when the feeling underneath is too large and too private for public exposure. What runs through all of these relationships consistently is Chanel's refusal to be financially dependent on any of them for longer than the early period of the relationship made structurally necessary. She repaid Capel. She maintained her own income, her own business, her own address. She accepted gifts, the jewellery, the houses, the access. But she never accepted the accompanying arrangement in which gifts constituted ownership. This, in the context of the early 20th century, was not a default setting. It was a deliberate daily choice, repeated across decades, and it cost her things, marriage perhaps, stability certainly, that she may have wanted more than she was able to admit. Any honest account of Coco Chanel has to grapple with the evidence of her anti-Semitism, not as a passing social prejudice of her time, though there was plenty of that in France in the first half of the 20th century, but as something she was willing to act on when it served her interests. The attempt to use wartime legislation to dispossess the Wertheimer family is the most documented instance, but scholars have pointed to other evidence: her social milieu in the 1930s, her wartime associations, certain recorded remarks. None of it sits comfortably alongside the Chanel mythology of radical individualism and female liberation. It is not possible to tell the full story of this woman honestly without including it, and it is not possible to understand her fully without recognizing that great talent and deeply ugly beliefs are not, historically speaking, mutually exclusive. The 1930s in France were a period of intensifying political polarization, and Chanel's social circle shifted in ways that are difficult to read as coincidental. Her relationship with the Duke of Westminster had introduced her to elements of the British right that were, in the 30s, engaged in the particular kind of appeasement politics that looked, from certain angles, like admiration. Her French social connections in this decade included figures associated with the nationalist right. The general atmosphere of the milieu she inhabited, wealthy, aristocratic, deeply invested in the preservation of existing social hierarchies, was one in which certain kinds of prejudice circulated as the unremarkable background radiation of dinner-table conversation. This is context, not excuse. The background radiation of a social milieu does not compel anyone to file legal documents designed to strip a family of their business using racial legislation. The Wertheimer action was not a casual expression of ambient prejudice. It was a considered legal strategy, drafted by lawyers, submitted to authorities, and pursued with the same methodical determination Chanel brought to everything she decided to do. She knew what the legislation was, she knew what it was for, she used it. The fact that it failed, that the Wertheimers had outmaneuvered her, does not retroactively change the nature of the attempt. There are biographers and admirers who have minimized this, who have argued that Chanel was primarily motivated by business grievance rather than genuine anti-Semitism, that the Wertheimer action was essentially a commercial dispute conducted through the available instruments of wartime law rather than an expression of ideological belief. This argument is not entirely without merit. Chanel's grievance against the Wertheimers was real and predated the war by years. The fact that she waited until the occupation to act on it does suggest that she was using the legislation instrumentally rather than ideologically, which is a distinction that matters somewhat. It does not matter as much as the argument requires it to. What makes this Chanel case genuinely difficult, rather than simply damning, is the coexistence of her ugliest qualities with her most liberating ones. The woman who used Nazi legislation to pursue a Jewish family was also the woman who dismantled the corset, shortened the hemline, and spent 60 years insisting that women's clothing should serve women's lives rather than constraining them. Both of these are true. They do not cancel each other out. They coexist in the same biographical record with the same stubborn factual persistence that characterizes everything else about her life. And the only honest response to that coexistence is to hold both without flinching, to refuse the temptation of either the hagiography that ignores the darkness or the prosecution that ignores the light. She was, in the fullest sense of the word, complicated. History tends to be. Among Chanel's personal relationships, none was stranger, more enduring, or more structurally difficult to categorize than her friendship with Misia Serre, Polish-born pianist, wife of the Spanish painter José María Serre, and one of the most connected women in the Parisian arts world of the early 20th century. Misia introduced Chanel to Diaghilev, to Stravinsky, to Picasso, to the whole shimmering network of the Ballets Russes circle. She also borrowed money from Chanel constantly, gossiped about her relentlessly, and competed with her in the particular way that close female friends in certain social circles compete, with enormous warmth and absolute ruthlessness, operating simultaneously. Their relationship lasted decades and ended, as many of Chanel's relationships did, in bitterness and unresolved grievance. Misia Serre was, by the time Chanel met her in the late teens, already one of the most socially significant women in Paris. Not because of her own artistic output, though she was a genuinely accomplished pianist, but because of her extraordinary gift for recognizing and connecting talent. She had been a muse to Toulouse-Lautrec, a friend and patron to Diaghilev, a central figure in the network that produced some of the most significant art of the early 20th century. She knew everyone. She was invited everywhere. She had the kind of social intelligence that reads a room in seconds, identifies the most interesting person in it, and makes that person feel as though they have been recognized by someone who matters because they had been. Chanel met her through Misia's then-husband Alfred Edwards, and the connection was immediate and mutual and complicated from the very beginning. What Misia gave Chanel was access, direct personal access to the artistic world that Chanel had been circling from the edges of since her arrival in Paris. Through Misia, she met Diaghilev and began the collaboration with the Ballets Russes. Through Misia, she entered the social world of the Parisian avant-garde as a participant rather than an observer. The introductions Misia made in those early years shaped Chanel's cultural identity in ways that the fashion work alone could not have done, gave her the depth of artistic engagement that made her more than a very successful dressmaker, and placed her, in her own understanding and the understanding of her contemporaries, in the company of people who were genuinely changing the culture. In exchange, Chanel gave Misia money, regularly, generously, and over a period of years that suggests the arrangement had become so normalized that neither of them commented on it much. Misia was not wealthy in the way Chanel had become wealthy. She was the kind of person who was always at the center of things and always, somehow, slightly short of funds, whose lifestyle ran ahead of her income with the cheerful confidence of someone who assumed the gap would be bridged. Chanel bridged it. This gave the friendship a structural imbalance that Misia managed with the skill of someone who had always understood how to be indebted without appearing diminished by it. The gossip was a separate matter entirely. Misia talked about everyone, including Chanel, with the particular intimacy of someone who knew where the bodies were buried because she had been present at some of the burials. The things she said about Chanel in private, the observations about her origins, her relationships, her ambitions, were sharp and sometimes cruel in the way that only close friends can be cruel, because they knew which observations would land and which ones were too true to deny. Chanel was not, by temperament, a person who forgave this kind of thing easily. The friendship survived it for decades through a combination of mutual need, genuine affection, and the particular inertia of relationships that have accumulated too much shared history to be cleanly ended. When it finally broke down in the years before Misia's death, it broke with the weight of everything that had never been said directly, which in both their cases was quite a lot. Coco Chanel was not, by the conventional standards of her era, a great beauty. She was slim, dark-featured, and deeply tanned at a time when fashionable women stayed pale under parasols. She had what contemporaries described as a gamin quality: boyish, angular, arresting rather than conventionally pretty. She wore her own clothes, of course, and wore them with the unself-conscious authority of someone who had decided once and for all that she was the ideal body type for the clothes she was making. This was not arrogance, or rather, it was not only arrogance, it was also, again, a philosophical position. She was designing for women who moved and worked and lived in the world, and she herself was a woman who moved and worked and lived in the world. She was the prototype. The rest was details. In 1910, the fashionable female body was a specific construction, full-busted, full-hipped, corseted to a narrow waist, organised into the S-curve that the Edwardian aesthetic required, and that the garments of the period were specifically engineered to produce. The ideal was amplitude, softness, the visible abundance of a body that did not appear to have been subjected to physical labour. Thinness was not fashionable. A tan was not fashionable. Both of these things suggested outdoor work, exposure to the elements, the kind of physical activity associated with people who did not have the means to avoid it. Fashionable women in 1910 were pale, cushioned, and carefully sheltered from the implications of their own physicality. Chanel was none of these things, and she seems to have decided fairly early in her career that rather than adjusting herself to the prevailing ideal, she would simply change the ideal. This sounds more deliberate than it probably was. She was not sitting in her atelier in 1912 thinking about how to redefine beauty standards as a strategic project. She was making clothes that fit her own body and her own life, and her own body happened to be slim and active and tanned because she rode horses and spent summers by the sea and had neither the time nor the inclination for parasols. The clothes she made for herself began to define what the clothed body could look like, and the definition spread. The tan is a specific and frequently cited example. Before Chanel, a tan was working class. It meant you spent your time outdoors without the means to avoid the sun. Chanel tanned visibly and publicly at Deauville and Biarritz and La Pausa, and was photographed doing it, and the photographs circulated through the fashionable press. And within a decade the tan had migrated from stigma to status symbol. The same woman who had dismantled the corset had now rearranged the social meaning of sun exposure. Neither of these was the result of a manifesto. Both were the result of a woman doing what she wanted and having enough cultural authority that the world reorganized its preferences around her choices. By the 1920s, the fashionable female silhouette was thin, flat-chested, short-haired, and deeply tanned, the precise inverse of the Edwardian ideal and the precise description of Coco Chanel. She had not set out to make herself the template. She had simply refused to make herself anything else, and the template had followed. There is a lesson in this about the relationship between self-possession and influence that is either inspiring or deeply unsettling depending on your view of how cultural change actually happens. With Chanel, it was always both at once. Coco Chanel gave very few interviews across a long career, and the interviews she did give were study performances rather than confessions. She returned, over and over, to the same carefully prepared anecdotes, the invented aunts, the shortened biography, the sanitized origins, and she repeated them with such consistency and such conviction that biographers spent decades untangling fact from construction. She understood, long before the concept had a name, what it meant to control a personal brand. The name Chanel was not just a label on a perfume bottle or a suit. It was a carefully maintained fiction about what elegance looked like and where it came from. The fiction was, in its way, as much a work of art as anything she put on a runway. The mechanism was simple and requires no particular machinery beyond a good memory and a willingness to repeat yourself. You decide on a version. You tell it consistently. You correct anyone who deviates from it with sufficient authority that they do not deviate again. You never, under any circumstances, say something new or surprising about the foundational events of your life. Because new and surprising is a crack in the structure, and cracks invite inspection. Chanel told the same stories for 60 years. The aunts, the provincial childhood, the natural talent discovered by chance, with such practiced ease that even people who spent considerable time in her company walked away feeling they had glimpsed something authentic, when what they had actually witnessed was a performance of authenticity so polished it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. The particular genius of the mythology was that it was not entirely false. The broad strokes of the invented biography, provincial origins, self-made success, talent nurtured without institutional support, were not fabrications in their essence, only in their specifics. She really had come from nothing. She really had built it herself. She really had educated her own taste through observation and instinct rather than formal training. The lies were in the details. The orphanage replaced by aunts, the birth year adjusted, the father erased. The outline was true, the texture was controlled. Paul Morand, the French writer who spent considerable time with Chanel in her final years and recorded their conversations in a book published after her death, noted the way she circled certain subjects and approached others with theatrical freedom, the way she would produce a devastating aperçu about a rival or a lover with the timing of someone who had deployed it before, and the way she would close off any approach toward the orphanage or the father with a brevity that did not invite follow-up. She was not evasive about the things she was willing to discuss. She was a magnificent talker, witty, precise, capable of the kind of observation that lands like a small detonation and reverberates afterward. The closed doors were all the more noticeable for how bright everything else was. The irony is that the true story was better. The abandoned child who built a fashion empire is a more compelling narrative than the modestly provincial girl with unidentified aunts who discovered she had talent. Chanel knew stories. She had spent her life constructing them. She must have known that hers was a good one. The fact that she chose the fiction over the truth anyway suggests that what she was protecting was not the story itself, but something underneath it. The feeling of being that child. The memory of what it had meant to have nobody coming back. The fiction was a shelter built around a wound, and she maintained it with the same meticulous care she brought to everything else she built. She just never let anyone close enough to see what it was for. In the final decade of her life, Coco Chanel continued designing with an intensity that would have been remarkable in someone 40 years younger. She was in her 80s, living at the Ritz. She had returned to Paris, returned to the hotel, returned to Rue Cambon, and she was still at the atelier, still adjusting hemlines with a straight pin and a precision that brooked no argument, still reportedly reducing assistants to tears with the particular combination of absolute standards and casual cruelty that had always defined her management style. She had outlived her contemporaries, outlived many of her enemies, outlived several of the fashion movements that had declared her obsolete. She showed no sign of stopping. She did not appear to have a plan for stopping. The daily routine of her final decade was both austere and absolute. She rose early, as she always had. She ate sparingly. She had always been indifferent to food in the way that people are indifferent to things they have never used for comfort, and food had never been a comfort for her. She walked from the Ritz to Rue Cambon, a journey of approximately 5 minutes that she made most working days of most working weeks for the last years of her life. She arrived at the atelier, she went upstairs to the workrooms, and she worked. The work was the same work it had always been, the pinning and the cutting and the adjusting, the relentless pursuit of the line that did what it was supposed to do, but conducted now with the authority of someone who had been doing it for 60 years and had no remaining patience for anything that fell short. The staff of the final decade were younger than any staff she had worked with before, which was simply arithmetic. She had outlasted the generations. The young women who came to work at Rue Cambon in the 1960s came to a workplace that was unlike anything else in fashion, run by a woman in her 80s who had invented the vocabulary they were working in, who had been doing this since before their parents were born, and who had not softened with age in any of the ways that age is supposed to soften people. She was exacting, demanding, and entirely clear about what she wanted, which the staff found simultaneously intimidating and educational in the way that exposure to absolute mastery tends to be. She also, in this period, gave the extended interviews and conversations that produced most of what we know of her inner life. The sessions with Paul Morand, the conversations with Claude Delay, the various journalists who managed to get past the performance long enough to record something that felt real. She was, in old age, more willing to talk than she had been in her prime, which is sometimes how it goes. The constructed self becomes less important to maintain when the projects it was protecting are finished, or when the person has simply been alive long enough to have earned the luxury of occasional honesty. What came through, in the interviews of her final years, was not softness exactly. She remained sharp, opinionated, and entirely capable of cruelty, but something that might be called clarity. She knew what she had done. She knew what it had cost. She was still working. That was enough. On the evening of January 9th, 1971, Coco Chanel was working. She had spent the day at her atelier on Rue Cambon preparing for an upcoming collection. She returned to the Ritz, told her maid she was unwell, and went to bed. She died the following morning, January 10th, alone in her room at the Hotel Ritz at the age of 87. Her last recorded words, addressed to her maid, were reportedly, "You see, this is how you die," which is, depending entirely on your tolerance for theatrical final remarks, either deeply affecting or entirely on brand. She had been staying in that hotel, on and off, for the better part of 40 years. She died, as she had largely lived, on her own terms, in her own space, with nobody particularly in charge of the situation but herself. The day of January 9th had been, by Chanel standards, an ordinary working day. She was preparing for a new collection. She was always preparing for a new collection, even at 87, even at a point when most people would have considered the body of work sufficient and the rest negotiable. She had been at Rue Cambon in the workrooms, doing what she'd done most days of her working life, looking at fabric, adjusting proportions, making the 1,000 small decisions that accumulate into a collection. She had then returned to the Ritz, as she did every evening, crossing the Place Vendôme in the January cold with whatever composed practicality she brought to all physical movement. Her apartment at the Ritz was not large by the standards of the hotel's grandest suites. It was characteristically correct rather than excessive, furnished with the pieces she had accumulated over decades, the objects that meant something rather than objects that demonstrated wealth. She had been living there in the form of her life since the 1930s, with interruptions for the war, for Switzerland, for La Pausa on the Riviera, and the rooms had accumulated the particular quality of spaces that have been genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied. It was her home in the truest sense. She had no other. She told her maid, Céline, that she was not feeling well. This was unusual enough to be noted. Chanel did not typically comment on physical discomfort, which she treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a condition requiring acknowledgement. She went to bed. During the night, she died. The cause was given as natural causes. Her heart, finally, after 87 years of exceptional service, decided it had done sufficient work. The maid found her in the morning. The last words, "You see, this is how you die," are reported by Céline and have been quoted so many times since that they have acquired the smooth, inevitable quality of apocrypha. They may be precisely true. They may be slightly adjusted in the retelling, sharpened in the way that perfect last words tend to be sharpened by the people who pass them on. What they sound like is Chanel, observational, dry, slightly instructional even in extremis, as though even dying was something that could be done correctly or incorrectly and she intended to demonstrate the right way. Whether she actually said it, or whether it is simply what she would have said, it fits. It fits her so precisely that it has entered the record as true regardless of its literal accuracy. In the end, her last line was as much a performance as everything else. She would have approved. Coco Chanel has been dead for over 50 years, and the house she built, the perfume, the suits, the interlocking C logo, the whole architecture of the brand, continues to generate billions of dollars annually and to occupy a position in fashion that has no real equivalent. But her personal legacy is something more complicated than a revenue figure. She is claimed, simultaneously, by feminists who point to her dismantling of the corset and her creation of practical, liberating clothing, and by critics who point to her wartime activities and her comfortable proximity to fascism. She is cited as an inspiration by women who have never worn a Chanel garment, and never will. She's a symbol of female self-invention in a world that did not particularly want women inventing themselves. She's also, depending entirely on which chapter you're reading, a cautionary tale about what self-invention sometimes costs other people. She was not a saint, she was not a monster. She was Coco Chanel, which was always going to be more complicated than either. The brand she left behind is, in commercial terms, one of the most successful luxury enterprises in the history of fashion. Karl Lagerfeld, who took the creative directorship of the house in 1983, spent 36 years expanding and reinterpreting the Chanel vocabulary with a fidelity to the underlying principles, the restraint, the quality, the insistence on the woman over the garment that Chanel herself might have recognized and approved, even if she would have had opinions about the details. After Lagerfeld's death in 2019, Virginie Viard took the reins, and the house continues, season after season, to produce work that is unmistakably descended from the original vision, while remaining distinctly of its own time. This is the measure of a truly foundational design language. It can be inhabited by people who did not create it, and it still holds. The personal legacy is harder to summarize cleanly. The feminist claim on Chanel is real and substantial. The corset, the hemline, the trousers, the insistence that women's clothing should serve women's lives rather than performing their subordination, these are genuine contributions to female freedom that cannot be written off by the complications of her biography. They changed what women wore, which changed how women moved, which changed what women could do, and that chain of consequence extends forward from 1915 to the present day in ways that are measurable and important. She did that. It counts. The wartime record also counts. The Wertheimer attempt counts. The intelligence file counts. The comfortable years at the Ritz while Paris suffered count. These are not separate from the woman who dismantled the corset. They are part of the same person, held together by the same set of values, which were always primarily Chanel's own values rather than anyone else's. She believed, above all else, in herself and in the correctness of her own judgment, and she acted on that belief without apology across every domain of her life, the creative, the commercial, the personal, and the moral. When her judgment was right, it produced the little black dress and Chanel No. 5. When it was wrong, it produced the Wertheimer documents. The same engine ran both. What she leaves behind, ultimately, is a question rather than an answer. A question about how to hold genius and ugliness in the same hand without dropping either. About what we owe to the people who changed the world for the better, while also causing real harm to specific other people. She is not the only figure in history who presents this problem. She is, perhaps, one of the most sharply drawn. The interlocking sea sits on bottles and bags and suits across the world, and somewhere underneath it, always, is the girl from the orphanage who decided she was worth more than the world had assigned her, and who was right about that, and wrong about a great many other things, and never, for a single day of her life, anything less than entirely herself. So tonight, you have travelled the full length of a life that refused, at every turn, to be what anyone expected it to be. You started in a poorhouse in Saumur and ended at the Hotel Ritz. You wore a borrowed pullover on a cold day in Deauville and changed the silhouette of the 20th century. You grew up in stone corridors, learning to sew under the supervision of nuns who had no idea what they were producing, and you spent the next 80 years proving that the most unlikely beginnings are sometimes the most productive ones, because they leave you with nothing to protect and nothing to lose, and an absolute bone-deep certainty that you will not be going back. Gabrielle Chanel was not an easy person. She was not, by any honest accounting, an entirely good one. She was difficult and contradictory and capable of real cruelty towards specific people in specific moments. and the wartime chapters of her story sit in the record without apology and without the possibility of being explained away. But she was also the woman who looked at a century of women sewn into their own clothing and said, quietly and with absolute authority, that this was not necessary, that a woman could move, that a woman could breathe, that elegance and freedom were not opposing forces and never had been, and that anyone who had told you otherwise had been lying for reasons of their own. She took the black of mourning and made it the colour of power. She took the fabric of men's underwear and turned it into the vocabulary of modern fashion. She took a number, 5, and made it the most recognised word in the history of perfume. She took a name that belonged to a lost dog in a provincial cabaret song and built it into something that outlived her by decades and shows no sign of stopping. History is full of people who changed the world without being redeemed by it, and full of people who were good without leaving a mark. Coco Chanel was neither of these. She left a mark, one of the deepest and most permanent in the history of how human beings clothe themselves and present themselves to the world, and she left it on her own terms, at her own pace, without asking permission from anyone whose permission she did not require. So tonight, as you settle into your clean sheets and your comfortable silence, perhaps wearing something that moves with you rather than against you, maybe spare a quiet thought for the girl in the convent corridor, cold stone under her feet, the smell of candle wax in the air, a needle in her hand, and somewhere underneath the discipline and the silence, a fury so quiet and so focused it would take 60 years and an empire to fully express. She made it out, she made it matter, and she did it, start to finish, entirely as herself. Sleep well,